So, as you may know, the trope of the bard dates back centuries. It likely goes without saying, but bards were actual people, although their social status and duties depended, of course, on time and place. For the ancient Celts, bards were often held in high regard, playing the harp, composing, performing elegies, eulogies, epic sagas, and even being employed as historians. In later societies, though, their positions and functions fluctuated. In some Welsh societies, noble bards were somewhat akin to the troubadour, whereas in some Gaelic societies, the bards were more typically lower class. In both Ireland and Scotland, bards were primarily poets, although music was certainly present. Later antiquarians frequently conflated these identities in the 18th century and onward. While in earlier societies, a bard might not have even had their works performed themselves, the concept of a bard as a type of wandering minstrel singing epic songs to the sounds of their harp became firmly embedded in the romantic popular imagination. And as Sarah Prescott, Karen Macaulay, and others have noticed, writers in particular focused on the bard as an emblem of distinct Irish, Scottish, or Welsh national identities, as opposed to a unified, quote, British identity. Collections of nationalistic poetry and song capitalized on that image, linking the minstrel bard figures in both text and imagery to a wild, naturalistic past, now endangered by the twinned rampages of technology and tyranny. These figures stood as mythical reminders of an equally mythical past, and thus were emblems of rebellion against despotic, read English, oppression. And to tie into our previous paper, one can think of the famed character Alan a Dale from Robin Hood as the minstrel. This predilection for linking the bard or minstrel with the grim wildness of the Irish or Scottish countryside, with its heaths and cairns, crumbling castles, abbeys, and other ancient landmarks, found a comfortable home in Gothic literature's, quote, yearning for a romanticized past. So too did the bard's traditional role as lore keeper, and in subsequent fantasy literature, as explored by Isabella van Elferen and others, bardic music and verse often had magic or supernatural agency. These traits have by no means disappeared in modern literature, by the way. Think, for example, of the tales of Beedle the Bard in Harry Potter. Like other elements of Gothic literature, the bard figure quickly crossed over into modern TV, film, and games. In Dungeons & Dragons, for example, the bard was a traditional storyteller, but often also a fighter, thief, or mage, with the power of, as the website TV Tropes calls it, magic music. Later games expanded the role of the bard. In addition to their knowledge of lore, they acted often as a morale booster or a source of healing for those around them. They might serenade the game's hero with praise or attack enemies with their musical skills. However, in many cases, the bard is more a hindrance than a help, their ability to do many things leaving them good at none. For example, in the Baldur's Gate series, bards are jacks of all trades, able to cast lower-level magical spells and perform some of the same tasks as thieves. But their real assets are the bard's song, which renders their party immune to magical fear and gradually restores morale, and their knowledge of lore, which allows them to identify many of the newly discovered items. Characters in games like The Witcher and Breath of the Wild, as we already heard a little bit about today, tell stories and sing or recite poetry, sometimes with clues as to how to progress through the game. Similarly, the bard hero Sim in The Sims Medieval plays and writes poetry, entertains with his lute, where the bard in Shovel Knight will purchase sheet music from you and perform songs from the game's soundtrack. In games such as Darkest Dungeon, though, the bard, here called a jester, is a more immediately useful character who uses his lute to buff his party and can even use humor to heal. And perhaps the most iconic bard in all video game history, is found in Final Fantasy IV, where the character Tella beats the bard with his fists and his cane, hurling insults at him, including the famous "you spoony bard," which is a real word. The games in which the bards played the most important roles, and which, by the way, were also fundamental to the development of the RPG genre, were the original Bard's Tale series, beginning in 1985. Where the bard could boost the strength and speed of his party members and use his songs to solve various puzzles. Centuries of tradition and creative reinvention come to a screeching halt here in the Bard's Tale, which, by the way, is unrelated to the previous Bard's Tale series. Originally released for the PlayStation 2 and Xbox in 2004, for PC a year later, and re-released on Steam and other platforms beginning in 2009, The Bard's Tale swaps out the bard of yesteryear with, as one website calls him, an anti-hero jackass. Here, the bard who has no other name is a cynical, lusty, and deeply apathetic character. He operates solely for his own benefit and has no interest in anything other than, quote, coin and cleavage. No quests, no saving the world, no rescuing princesses in far-off towers, except, of course, when said princess happens to be stunningly gorgeous and quite willing to please. Yes, in a typical action RPG, play involves exploring the game world, usually from an aerial 3D perspective, solving puzzles, completing quests, managing items in an inventory, and engaging in real-time combat. The main player, or character, often designed by the player and accompanied by a party that might also have been designed by the player, levels up throughout the game, adding on new capabilities and improving skills. And because such games tend to have strong storylines, they often involve voiceover narration or dialogue that can affect the course of the game. The Bard's Tale in many ways does meet that definition. The Bard, perfectly voiced by Carrie Elways, of Princess Bride and Robin Hood Men in Tights fame, reluctantly agrees to save the Princess Calais from imprisonment, of course, on top of a far-off tower. He must search for weapons, abilities, and clues to her whereabouts, all the while fighting off minions of the princess's abductor. He's accompanied at all times, albeit invisibly, by the weary narrator, voiced by veteran actor Tony Jay, who bemoans his fate and unleashes his scorn at the Bard at every possible opportunity.
So, once again, having left a wake of death and destruction behind him, the bard continued onward towards the island tower in search of the fair maiden Calais. Now, you may ask yourself, was his mind weighed down with the burden of saving the world? The lives he had taken? Friends he had lost? Or was he just wondering what the princess looked like naked? I'm sure that answer is painfully obvious.
In dialogue with the various creatures the bard encounters, he, or rather the player, has the choice between being snarky or nice, which, in addition to adding even more humor to the game, also has the occasional ramifications for subsequent events. However, the game is missing a few important criteria. There's no inventory for a player to manage. All loot and weapons are automatically sold for cash at the moment of their discovery. Also significant is that there's no party, per se. The bard can operate alone if he so chooses, but the game is virtually impossible to navigate without the help of his magical cohort. You see, as the bard moves throughout the game, he will learn new tunes and find new instruments. These allow him to summon a variety of magical creatures, at first just one and then later on up to 4 others that can attack enemies, search for traps, or provide healing. So, in these respects, the Bard's Tale subverts all the tropes. It does not follow all the typical RPG rules, and it continuously pokes fun at the staple characteristics of the genre. The bard and the narrator, as you heard, snipe at each other, often breaking the fourth wall to do so. One of the most powerful weapons in the game is called the Ego Sword, which totally taunts the bard. There are multiple characters with the same name, leaving you to not be able to tell them apart, and of course, the princess is always in yet another tower. Moreover, the bard himself is a total anti-hero, and an anti-bard. He's in this quest solely for booty, in every sense of that word, and cares not a whit for the world at large. While many heroes start out reluctant but grow into their roles, the bard actually gets the choice at the end of the game, spoiler alert, to destroy the world and stay with the demon princess Calais, or even to walk away and party with the undead while the world burns around him. And unlike bards of history, myth, and game legend, he doesn't play the harp. He does not narrate his own or anyone else's story. He boosts literally no one's morale. And while he has musical and magical powers, they cannot directly affect himself or his enemies. They can only summon other beings to do his dirty work for him. While the idea that the Bard's Tale is a humorous parody of action RPGs is certainly not new, and in fact is built into the game's publicity, the role that music plays in the game's subversiveness has not yet been discussed. In a typical RPG, as well as in many genres, music is a crucial part of the game experience, which is why we are all here today. Everything from the title theme to musical cues, songs, and speech to the usually omnipresent soundtrack informs the game's player about their location and their goals. But The Bard's Tale is not a typical RPG, and the music shows it. While music is ostensibly at the heart of the game, I mean, after all, the main character is a bard, the game itself is often rather quiet. There is surprisingly no real soundtrack to speak of. In the earliest stages of the game, as the bard navigates the village of Heightened, you might occasionally hear a hint of bagpipes as you pass by a building. Yes, he did just tip a cow. While this sound certainly reinforces the idea of a medievalist romantic Scottish setting, this hardly a soundtrack makes, and as the bard traverses the countryside, other similar soundtrack-like musics are virtually non-existent. We're left with a musical premise, or at least a musical main character, with no music. This quietude does several things. It focuses the player's attention on other sounds, environmental noises, the narration and dialogue, and later on, the sounds of battle. But it also characterizes both the bard and the game as parodies. After all, what is an action RPG without its epic soundtrack? What's a hero without his John Williams-penned theme song? This land might be filled with strange and wondrous things, but to the bard, they're just standing in his way. And as for the bard himself, to be roaming about in a tuneless land only reinforces the idea that he might not be that much of a bard after all. This isn't to say the whole game is without music, though. Music is employed strategically and significantly throughout the game, beginning in that village of Heightened. After some wink-wink, nudge-nudge flirtation with the buxom barmaid Mary McCrary, and being set on his very first cliched task of the game, to clear her basement out of rats, the bard overhears a group of drunks singing in the corner. This tune, the first of several songs interspersed at key moments throughout the game, makes quite clear the kind of scenario we have found ourselves in.
Beer, 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 tiddly beer, beer, beer. A long time ago, way back in history, when all there was to drink was nothing but prosody, along came a man by the name of Charlie Ross, and he invented a wonderful drink and he made it out of hops.
It goes on for quite some time. This charming little ditty is a real song called, unsurprisingly, Beer, 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 or An Ode to Charlie Mops. It's an actual folk song originating somewhere in Ireland or England, likely by the 1800s, and has actually been recorded a number of times, beginning with the folk music revival of the 60s. The readily apparent folkiness of the song further paints the geographical portrait for the game player, like the bagpipes, orienting them in this vaguely Scotch-Irish-British landscape. It's a lowbrow ode to beer and its fictional creator, which both entices the bard and repulses him. The drunken enthusiasm of the bar patrons is a bit too much even for him, and he walks away to talk to other people. Placing this first song of the game into the mouths of a bunch of tavern drunks and not into the mouth of our bard separates him from music in the game and lets us know perhaps the kind of bard that he is. These bar patrons aren't the only ones to sing to the bard. At several points throughout the game, the bard encounters a group of trow. Now, trow are mischievous fairies or spirits, part of the folklore of the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland, where the former Bard's Tale series occurs, and this one is supposed to take place nearby. The trow are well known to be music lovers and will often kidnap or otherwise lure away musicians. But here, the trow definitely do not want to lure the bard away. They're there to ridicule him in witty, simple, out-of-tune song.
Oh, it's bad luck to be you. A chosen one of many isn't new. When you think you're full of luck,
in the bullets you'll get struck.
Oh, it's bad luck to be you.
This also goes on for a while. The trow, as you might have picked up on, are rather reminiscent of the Oompa Loompas from Willy Wonka. They're short, ugly, and very blunt. They sing both about the bard and directly to him, telling him that he's an unlucky, doomed fraud. Their songs thus supplement the narration provided by Tony J, the invisible narrator, taunting the bard, but also repeatedly referencing ways in which the bard and the game don't adhere to typical standards. The last of the sung interludes that I'll talk about here today is performed by a bevy of bodes. Once the bard arrives in Kirkwall, he's directed to find one man named Bode, who will give him some important music and eventually take him to the Princess Calais herself. However, one bode leads to another, and the bard ends up having to locate 5 people by the same name in order to complete his quest. To communicate with Calais, they sing this incantation.
If this were a stage, I'd boo you off.
So it's a wordless, melodically simple, metrically kind of odd, and once again, very out of tune little ditty, complete with cowbell, which you can't see here. The bard's reaction to say, if this was a stage, I'd boo you off, implies that he could do it better if he wanted to, if he could be bothered, which he never is. All of these examples of interspersed song are simple. They're all out of tune. None of them are particularly complicated, and yet our bard never attempts to show off his own musical powers, to top them. He does, however, play, which brings me to my next set of observations. The primary source of music in this game are the myriad spells that the bard can cast with his cache of instruments, a lute, a recorder or flute thing, and later on some weapons. Throughout the game, the player finds new instruments and tunes, learning how to strategically deploy each summoned creature to best effect. In this regard, the player is the actual primary music maker of the game, not the bard, which ties into the little bouncing yellow ball because you at home can sing along with all of these folks. I'd like to spend my remaining time discussing the significance of this type of summoning music, because more so than any of the other kinds of music in the game, it occurs the most frequently, and I argue it's the most subversive. When the bard summons his magical creatures, it demonstrates that he has musical prowess, but it actually turns the tropes of the bard and the RPG on their heads. Because once summoned, the player has little control over the creatures in his party, unlike a typical RPG where the player can decide what every member of a party does. These creatures can level up, but not through any achievement of their own. The bard has to locate enhanced tunes that allow him to summon better versions. These characters can affect neither the narration nor the plot. Their vocalizations are short and repetitive and are identical regardless of time or action in the game. And yes, it's the bard who has the musical power to summon these creatures, but no magical ability to directly affect his enemy or himself. All the effects are those of the creatures, not the bard. You can hear each character's individual tune clearly, regardless of what other sounds might be occurring at the time. And again, tying into Dana's paper on Robin Hood, a lot of these tunes are quasi-Elizabethan, sort of Renaissance-y, colonial-era even folk songs, short modal arpeggios, scalar passages that fit with the Scots-Irish folk song theme. But you can't always see the bard playing his instrument to call them forth. If nothing else is happening, then as long as the bard's front is facing the camera, then you will see him put away his weapons and retrieve his instrument of choice to play whatever tune you've asked him to play. However, if, as typically happens, the bard is in the thick of battle and needs help, it does not behoove him to sheath his sword with enemies nearby, so he must run away. So he has to flee his enemies to pull out an instrument, call forth a creature that can then do his dirty work for him and fight the battle. This means the bard's back, as you saw, might be to the camera, leaving you at home to only hear and not see the musical instrument. Not only does this downplay the visual aspects of music within the game, but it also further marks the bard as an anti-hero, someone who runs away from battle in order to send others in to do his job for him. When the bard obtains the ego sword at the end of the game, it even taunts the bard for this very thing while praising itself. And if the bard is wielding this sword when summoning a creature, he doesn't even need a musical instrument, for the sword will simply sing the tune itself.
Need me again? I thought so. La 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 la.
So in this instance, the music we hear belongs more to the sword than the bard. And I have one last example. Even the medievalist aspects of this game are subverted through this type of music. Again, at the end of the game, the bard winds up with another advanced weapon, the shadow axe. Pun very much intended, the bard plays this glowing purple axe to summon the creatures to the strains of an electric guitar. This kind of using overtly out-of-place modern music is reminiscent of music in films like A Knight's Tale and Black Knight, and so I draw on the work of Caroline Jewers there. And I will skip this example, but there's a hip-hop dance-off between the undead that deserves some mention in this, the article version of this, which will come out later. In all cases, the tunes and their summoned creatures act enough like a party for RPG comfort, but differ in several crucial ways. As they develop over the game, they further undermine the idea of the bard as a hero, and even as a bard, although at the end it seems that he gets to live out his rock and roll fantasy. So to conclude for the day, I've argued here, and will flesh out further in the print version, that the typical traits of both RPGs and the bardic figure are humorously subverted in the Bard's Tale. And while this parodic approach plays out, pun intended, rather obviously via narration, dialogue, and game narrative, it also plays out, or not, as the case may be, through music. Thank you.
Through no fault of Karen, we are now cutting into the 1.5-hour lunch break. I imagine maybe we could take one question and then have the remaining discussion over food.
Or all over food.
I want to see the hip-hop battle. Yeah.
It goes on for a while.
We will reconvene at 1:30. Have a great lunch, everybody.